Imagine a future European election where your vote directly decides who leads the European Union. Picture this: you're not just voting for a political party, you're voting for the person who could become the president of the EU. The frontrunner of the political group with the most votes across Europe takes the top spot. This means the end of confusing scenarios where the person you supported doesn't end up in the lead. A perfect example of this confusion happened 5 years ago, where the EPP got the most votes. Back then, Manfred Weber, the leader of the EPP, was expected to get the EU's top job. However, in a surprising U-turn, Ursula von der Leyen was chosen instead. But is this all about to change? Is the EU about to tackle one of its biggest democratic deficiencies? A groundbreaking EU reform proposal has recently passed the European Parliament. With the proposed change, what you see on the ballot is what you get in leadership, making your vote more straightforward and more impactful. But this is just a fraction of the reform proposal, as there are many pages of proposed changes to the European Union, some of which will drastically change how the EU operates today. This is the second video in a series where we are closely monitoring EU reform and how these changes will affect you. We highly recommend you watch the previous video first, linked above, as this will give you a detailed overview of what the reform proposal plans to change. In this second video, we will deep dive into some of the bigger proposed changes and evaluate the pros and cons. We will also look at the status of the treaty today and the road ahead in 2024. So what is the reform proposal all about? Well, the proposal is structured in 3 parts: reshaping EU institutions, more EU competencies, and boosting EU authority. First off, we're talking about a major shake-up in how the EU operates. The European Parliament is set to receive more power, kind of like an upgrade. This is a big win for us, the voters, because the Parliament directly represents our voices. The Council, on the other hand, will need to share power with the Parliament, meaning they'll work together to decide on all key EU policies. And the European Commission is gearing up for a complete overhaul. If you're not familiar with these institutions, think of them as different branches of government, each playing a unique role. Here is a full list of all the proposed changes, which we explained in detail in our previous video. You can also pause the video now, in case you want to read through them. For EU Made Simple, the most significant proposal is replacing the veto power of member states with qualified majority voting. In this system, a decision can pass if it's supported by at least 55% of member countries, which must also represent at least 65% of the total EU population. Let's put it into perspective. Currently, any single country, like Germany or France, can block a decision, even if all other countries agree. Qualified majority voting would change this dynamic, making decision-making more about the majority's choice rather than requiring unanimous agreement. But removing the veto is a contentious issue, with plenty of countries against the idea, with the following concerns. The big one is national sovereignty, especially for smaller countries. Today, the EU's smallest countries, like Malta, Cyprus, and Luxembourg, can single-handedly block certain EU policies they disagree with. But with the shift to qualified majority voting, where there is a stronger focus on the majority, these smaller nations might feel less heard, especially compared to large countries like Germany or France. This change could make them feel like they have less control over their own affairs, affecting their national sovereignty. The requirement for consensus also forces member states to find common ground. Without the veto vote, there's a risk of deepening divides on sensitive issues, such as fiscal policies or immigration rules, as countries might align in majority versus minority blocs. As a result, Euroscepticism could rise in the minority blocs if they keep getting overruled. But of course, there are also strong reasons for removing the veto vote. For one, decisions can be made much faster, especially in critical situations like the migrant crisis, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, or climate change, as full consensus from all 27 member states is no longer needed. Next, the veto vote does not reflect the will of the majority, arguably making the EU more undemocratic. For example, under the current system, a small country like Malta, with a population of around 500,000 people, which represents a bit over 0.1% of the EU's total population, can block decisions that the other 99.9% of Europeans support. Lastly, the veto allows for situations that could be viewed as political blackmail. For instance, Hungary, under Orban's leadership, has continuously utilized its veto to stall EU decisions, most recently 500 billion euros in aid to Ukraine. This move is perceived by some as a tactic to negotiate around 30 billion euros in EU funds for Hungary. Personally, at EU Made Simple, I see where the smaller EU member states are coming from with their concerns. But hey, what if there's a middle ground? Instead of just qualified majority, how about a super qualified majority? This way, a proposal can only pass if 75% of the member states, representing 80% of the EU's population, give the thumbs up. This means at least 21 countries would need to agree on something before it gets the green light. This will give smaller countries a chance to team up and have their say if they want to block a proposal. It's all about finding that sweet spot where everyone's voice matters, but decisions can still be made efficiently. Next up in the proposal are more EU competencies. As you can see on the screen, we're looking at the EU stepping up its game in a bunch of different areas. For instance, when it comes to the environment, the EU is set to have exclusive competency. This means it gets the final say in making and applying rules to protect our planet. And that's not all. In sectors like industry, the EU will share competency. Think of it as teaming up with member states to drive innovation and growth. By this point, I'm sure many of you are thinking, but what about member state sovereignty? It's a valid concern, as some power would indeed shift from individual member states to the EU.
Thank you, Mr. President. The report is a living proof of how dangerous the EU has become. One is reminded of a well-known story about Dr. Frankenstein, who wanted to create a perfect being, and instead he created a monster. What the report proposes is the grabbing of all essential competences of the member states, thereby reducing the national institutions to ornamental functions. Should the reform come into effect, they will have less power than German Länder. Who the hell do you think you are to place yourselves above the member states? You do not have the legislative initiative, thank heavens for that. Your democratic legitimacy is scarce, your record lamentable, your respect for law non-existent.
However, reform supporters argue that we need to look at the bigger picture. For example, in terms of industry, the EU is competing with giants like the USA with its Inflation Reduction Act and China with its Made in China 2025 strategy. Both of these countries are pumping hundreds of billions of euros into their economy to try and attract companies. We've already seen major Europe-based companies like Bayer and Tesla's battery production move their manufacturing to China and the US respectively. Even Europe's economic powerhouse, Germany, has a GDP that is only about a quarter the size of China's and a sixth of that of the United States. This presents a significant question. Can individual EU countries truly compete on their own on the global economic stage? Some argue the answer is no, and the solution lies in EU teamwork. The idea is for EU countries to pool their industrial strengths and resources, forming a united front. It's about creating substantial investments that could rival or even surpass those of the massive Chinese and American programs. If this is pursued as individual member states, the investments will be much smaller. This not only limits the potential for growth and competition, but also risks causing more harm than good, as these countries might end up competing against each other more than against external economic powers. This idea of unity and strength in numbers isn't limited to industry. It's equally vital in other areas, especially in foreign policy, so that our European interests can be protected on the global stage.
The war in Ukraine continues. The assault on the rule of law continues. Viktor Orban vetoes continue. And on top of that, there is the war in Gaza, the pressing question of enlargement also. And yes, the risk of Donald Trump returning. So EU reform is now undeniably a question of, to use the word our opponents always use against us, sovereignty. Seen through the perspective of today's world, there is nothing so harmful to our sovereignty as refusing to make Europe united. All sovereignty will be European, or it will be gone, finished. And between the proposals now on the table and the European elections next year, this is, I think, our moment to push ahead, to push the message that Europe can be more effective, can be safer, can have a stronger voice internationally, but must be reformed in order to be all those things together.
This statement comes from Guy Verhofstadt, MEP of Renew Europe and co-rapporteur on the proposal of the European Parliament on the amendment of the treaties. He also works closely with the Union of European Federalists, our video sponsor. Established in 1946, the Union of European Federalists has been a steadfast advocate for a European federation. UEF is a cross-border, non-governmental political collective of dedicated individuals fervently working towards the vision of a European federation. See their details in the description if you want to know more. Next up in the proposal is boosting EU authority in ensuring member states follow EU laws, especially its core values. Presently, there's a mechanism in place, known as Article 7, often referred to as the nuclear option. This provision, when triggered, has the power to strip a member state of certain rights, including their voting right, if they are found in breach of essential EU principles. Yet its potency has been undermined by informal political arrangements, like the mutual understanding between Hungary and Poland, where they promised not to use it against each other. To address this, the proposal intends to move the responsibility of triggering this article from the European Council, where it can be vetoed by a single member state, to the more impartial Court of Justice of the European Union. So where are we today? On November the 22nd, the European Parliament narrowly voted in favor of the proposal, with 291 votes for, 274 against, and 44 abstentions. However, it wasn't all smooth sailing. Two key parts of the proposal were shot down. First, the plan to grant the EU its own fiscal capability was rejected. This means that the EU won't be able to independently raise new funds or manage its budget. Financial decisions will still require unanimous agreement from each member country and its parliament, maintaining the status quo of national control over EU financial matters. Second, the proposal to hold EU-wide referendums was also rejected. This means that EU citizens won't have the opportunity to directly vote on major EU policies. With the majority of the proposal still in place, attention now turns to the next crucial step. These are the 5 stages the proposal has to go through, and the first 2 have now been successfully completed. Next up is the Council, where the EU member states need to vote in a meeting most likely scheduled for March. If a simple majority of 14 out of the 27 member states agree, then the next stage will be initiated, which is a treaty reform convention. This is a massive gathering of representatives from EU governments, national parliaments, the European Parliament, and the European Commission, where treaty reform is discussed and negotiated. After they reach an agreement, each country in the EU has to officially ratify, or in other words, approve these changes. An interesting aspect of this proposal is a requirement for ratification. Traditionally, treaty reform needs to be ratified by all 27 EU member states. However, this proposal specifies that only 4 out of 5 member states need to agree on the final reform for it to be implemented, which translates to 22 out of 27 member states. Now, this really is an ace up the sleeve, as getting all 27 member states to agree at the end seems impossible. The result of this convention could shape the future of the European Union, impacting its policies, governance structure, and role on the global stage. We'll be keeping a close eye on these developments, and a part 3 of the series will follow in March, and of course, many more in case of a convention. So subscribe to stay informed, and if you'd like to support the channel, please consider signing up to Patreon. Until next time.